From the studios, yesterday, May 19th, was primary day in 6 states. And we had some other elections of interest going on. The big thing that you're going to hear about this morning, if you weren't paying attention last night, is that Donald Trump is going to claim another victory here. Congressman Thomas Massie, Republican from Kentucky, defeated in a GOP primary after Trump came out and endorsed his opponent. So Massie, as you may well know, he has been a thorn in Donald Trump's side, despite being a pretty firm conservative. Donald Trump has seen Massie as a problem because of his doggedness over the Epstein files and over things like the Iran war. So Donald Trump did not want him to be around anymore. Kentucky Republican voters in the 4th District gave him what he wanted. Now, I'll have more to say on that in a minute. Let's get into the results here. So at the time I recorded this, Ed Gallrein, the candidate who was endorsed by Donald Trump, ended up with about 55% of the vote, just a little under 55% of the vote. Whereas Thomas Massie, the incumbent, got about 45%. It was a two-candidate race. And the margin for Gallrein was about 9.8%. So as the results started coming in, you could tell, even from early on in the night, that it wasn't going to go his way, because you saw Lewis County, which was Massie's home county, that was going his way. But then as every other county started reporting, even in the early results, pretty much every other county was going for Gallrein. And once the suburban Cincinnati counties, they're in North Kentucky, once those started coloring in for Gallrein, that was pretty much it. Now, I'll say this. It's entirely possible that with the things that Massie has said and done, especially during this particular congressional term, even if Donald Trump had sat the race out, it's still possible that Massie might have been voted out. I don't know that he wouldn't have been. We'll never know. But Donald Trump did weigh into this race, and he said, get rid of this guy. And we're coming off of a situation where just a couple of days ago, Donald Trump endorsed a primary challenger against a sitting U.S. Senator in Louisiana, and he lost. And now, another situation. He endorsed a primary challenger against a sitting congressman, and he lost. And now, looking forward to next week, Donald Trump endorsed a primary challenger in a runoff against another sitting U.S. Senator, who I think he was probably going to lose anyway, but we know that Trump likes to back winners, or at least likes to give the illusion that he's backing winners. So that will probably happen too. So it's just a continuation of the trend. If Donald Trump says he supports a person, generally speaking, Republican primary voters are going to agree. But this is just another case of somebody who, in the party, ran afoul of the president, and the president wanted him gone, and he's gone. So Massie will be out of Congress. This is a heavily Republican seat, the 4th District of Kentucky. So I'm sure Gallrein will win the general election in November. But another very interesting development in the GOP. And if you thought that, after 10, 11 years of Donald Trump having a stranglehold on the Republican Party, that it was starting to break, it is not. That is for sure. So talk about a few other primary results. So there was also a primary for U.S. Senate in Kentucky that took place because Mitch McConnell, who has been in the Senate for decades, literal decades, 42 years, he is hanging him up for good in November. So the more interesting primary here was the Democratic primary. So Charles Booker, who was a state rep, who has run for statewide office a couple of times. He ended up winning this primary. He beat Amy McGrath, another Democrat who has run for office in Kentucky a few times unsuccessfully. He ended up winning the race by about 11 points. There were other candidates in the race, but we're only going to show you the top two for any of these. And some races, when we get into Georgia, those are going to runoffs. We'll show you those. But this particular primary was down to Booker and McGrath, and Booker ended up winning the day. But who will Booker be running against? And he is going to be running against the congressman from the 6th District, Andy Barr. So Barr's main opponent in this race was Daniel Cameron. He was a former state attorney general who had run for governor, I believe, in the last cycle. But Barr beat him pretty easily. It was about a 30-point margin. So I think you can say, well, it's Kentucky, so I'm sure at this point that Barr will be heavily favored to win the general election in November. So now moving on to Georgia. So a little bit of an interesting thing happened in Georgia. So over the course of the week with the early voting and then the election day voting, it was surmised that Democrats actually had a very good electorate. The Democrats actually had turned out very, very well. But what happened was you had a couple of Supreme Court elections, and the Republican-aligned candidates in these nonpartisan elections, the Republican-aligned candidate won them. In fact, one of the races was a blowout. The closer race, which involved the Democratic-aligned candidate, Miracle Rankin, she lost too, despite the electorate in Georgia tilting Democratic. So that will be very interesting for political analysts in Georgia to try to break down why it is that happened, why apparently a decent number of Democrats crossed over to vote for Republican judges in the Supreme Court in Georgia. So very interesting results there. But we're getting back to primaries now. So there were some interesting primaries going on in Georgia. So, of course, Brian Kemp, the incumbent governor, he cannot run for re-election. So there will be a runoff on the Republican side. So the top two finishers there are Burt Jones and Rick Jackson. So, of course, Burt Jones is the incumbent lieutenant governor of Georgia. Rick Jackson is a businessman. So in third place, not on this screen, is Brad Raffensperger. He is the Georgia Secretary of State. He finished well behind the other two. So you may remember Brad Raffensperger from the 2020 presidential election. He was the Secretary of State that Donald Trump called and said, find me 11,780 more votes. And Raffensperger said no. And there have been Republicans who haven't quite forgiven him for that. So he was never really going to get any traction in this GOP primary. And the results show that clearly the GOP wanted somebody else. So Jones and Jackson will move on to a runoff. But the Democratic side will not. So the Democratic nominee for Georgia governor will be Keisha Lance Bottoms. She is the former mayor of Atlanta. She ended up winning this race outright. She got 56%. So, of course, in Georgia, the runoff threshold, if you don't get 50% plus one, a simple majority of the vote, you go to a runoff. So Bottoms has definitely cleared that 50% plus one mark. So the Republicans will slug it out in a runoff, and she is off to the general election. So then there was also the primary for the U.S. Senate. So you know Jon Ossoff, he won his primary. Jon Ossoff, we have the race as a toss-up right now, but honestly, I think we could just as well have it as tilt Democratic or even lean Democratic, because so far the news for Ossoff has been pretty good, and now the Republicans are going to be going to a runoff. So the two top candidates there are Mike Collins and Derek Dooley. So now Mike Collins, he is a congressman. He is leading the pack with 40% of the vote. Now, Derek Dooley ended up in second place. Now, Derek Dooley, if you've heard that name before, on SEC football Saturdays, he was the coach at the University of Tennessee. Decided to get into politics, and so far looks like he's proving to be a better candidate for office, perhaps, than a football coach in the SEC. So he is off. Bit of a shady comment by me. Don't mind me. He is off to the runoff. So one of the defeated candidates here is Buddy Carter. He is a congressman from down in the Savannah area. And actually, if you look at the electoral map of this primary, you would see that whole area of coastal Georgia around his first district of Georgia. All those counties went for him, and pretty much nowhere else in the state did. Most counties went for Collins. You had some that went for Dooley. And for the record, Dooley carried Athens, University of Georgia. So I guess showing some respect to a rival, or maybe some Republican voters went into the booth and said, hey, I recognize that guy's name. Didn't we used to beat their team in football? So, maybe that's what it is. But either way, Collins versus Dooley, that is your runoff in the GOP Senate race there in Georgia. So now we just want to keep moving through these. We're going to move to Pennsylvania now. So some interesting results out of the Keystone states. So we're not going to talk about the governor's race because we knew that was going to be the Democrat incumbent Josh Shapiro versus the Republican Stacey Garrity. But the 3rd district of Pennsylvania, this is interesting because this is one of the bluest seats in the entire country. This seat is smack in the middle of Philadelphia. So a Democrat is going to win this seat. The primary basically is the general election. So you, of course, attracted a number of Democrats with different outlooks on how to go about things. And the winner in this race was Chris Rabb. He is a state representative in Pennsylvania. And one article that I saw out there this morning described him as, quote, a progressive firebrand. So this can definitely be construed as a win for the left here. Sharif Street was his closest opponent, and Rabb ended up winning this race by about 15 points. So he is off to the general election, which he will almost certainly win. And then the progressive caucus, the so-called squad in the House, are pretty much going to gain another member, at least as far as I can tell. But then the 7th district of Pennsylvania, let's talk about this one too. So this seat, this was a Republican flip back in 2024. So the former congresswoman here was Susan Wild. She lost that seat by 1 point in the good Republican year in 2024. So this seat, it's Allentown and areas to the north, getting into the Poconos. This is basically an even partisan seat. Democrats are going to fight hard, and this will be a top target for them in 2026. And the winner of the Democratic primary here was Bob Brooks. He is a fireman. He ended up being Ryan Crosswell. There was another candidate, Lamont McClure, who is the county executive of Northampton County. He ended up slipping actually into 3rd place in this race. But then, as we recorded this, he actually jumped back into 2nd. So Brooks, either way, is the winner. The real battle here is for 2nd place between McClure and Crosswell. But no question, Brooks is going to be the Democratic nominee in this seat, which, again, will be a top Democratic target in 2026. And then just very briefly, because quite frankly, the further into the election night we got last night, the less interesting the results got. So in Alabama, there were some primaries. So there are going to be runoffs for the U.S. Senate race. Doug Jones is going to be the Democratic nominee for governor in Alabama. He's going to run again against Tommy Tuberville, the guy who knocked him out of the Senate in 2020. In Idaho, there were no surprises at all. Brad Little, the incumbent governor, won his primary. Jim Risch, the incumbent senator, he's through. The Oregon governor's race in 2026 is going to be a rematch of 4 years ago. So, of course, Tina Kotek, the incumbent governor, she sailed through her primary. Christine Drazin has won the Republican nomination for governor, and she will be back on the ballot. And of course, 4 years ago, there was also an independent candidate that was skewing the numbers because the independent took quite a good chunk of the vote. but that's going to be a rematch in Oregon where the Republicans have not won the governor's race in literal decades. We're talking since the 1980s was the last time they won a gubernatorial election in Oregon. So that is a look at the primaries. We got a big runoff coming up next week in Texas. We will be all over that. And in the meantime, like and subscribe. Follow us on social media. We'll see you soon.